Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here in this beautiful room to discuss questions of values and the global challenges that we face. Many of you will know my work in relating to animals and the question of what are our ethical obligations to animals, how do we defend the way we treat animals or not defend it and change it. And that, of course, in part at least, relates to the work of the World Wildlife Fund and general issues about protection of the environment. And then I think we're all very concerned at the moment about the question of climate change. Again, I was just on Start the Week this morning with Nicholas Stern, who of course produced a review for the British government about climate change, in which he talked about the urgency of doing something about this issue. And as he pointed out, when that report came out a couple of years ago, some people criticised him for taking what they said was the worst case scenario. He was giving too much weight to the risk of that we would be in the worst case scenario, the higher levels of temperature increase of something as much as 5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. But as he pointed out, it's now looking as if those worst case scenarios, as they seemed even as recently as 2.5 years ago, are something that is actually becoming more likely scenarios than they were before, because we now know that greenhouse gas emissions have been increasing at a faster rate than predicted, and the Earth's ability to absorb the greenhouse gases is actually less than we'd expected. So although that was seen as an alarmist report, the alarms have continued to ring even more strongly since. And I do think that that's a very urgent global challenge that we must face, and one that clearly gives rise to some questions about the values with which we face it. We, that is, people living reasonably comfortable lives in the affluent world, have obligations to assist those living in extreme poverty, and that obligation is in some way analogous to the obligation that we would have to rescue a small child whom we happened to see had fallen into a shallow pond. So I imagine that you are walking past a pond in a park. When you see a small child who's fallen in, you look around for the parents or the babysitter, but there's nobody else there. You realise that if you don't rush into the pond as quickly as you can to pull the child out, there's a good chance the child will drown. You also are aware of the fact that you're wearing your most expensive pair of shoes, which unluckily you put on this morning, and which will no doubt get ruined if you wade into them, with wearing them into that shallow pond, but there's no time to take them off. Now, in those circumstances, virtually everybody says, well, the shoes are irrelevant. How can you even think about the value of a pair of shoes as compared to the value of a child's life? And I think that's a judgment, obviously, that we should make. They are not comparable values. But if that's so, it seems to suggest that if we can save a child's life, even if the child is more distant from us, say the child is in Mozambique or any other developing country where there's a lot of extreme poverty, it's also the case that we should be prepared to give up the cost of a pair of shoes to save that child's life. Now, the objection that was made to that argument when I put it many years ago, or I should say one of the objections, because there are a number of objections, one of the objections made was that the idea of moral obligation that I put forward in that article was, to use the words of one of my critics, too flat. That is, I just seem to have this idea that we have moral obligations to children everywhere. And this, the critic argued, was wrong. It's rather more like a kind of a gradual slope, if you like, that we have strong obligations to those who are close to us, first and foremost to our own children, then to other kin, then perhaps to close friends and those in our immediate community, then maybe to our fellow nationals, fellow citizens of the country where we live, and only then to strangers in other countries. So the argument was for a kind of a slope or a stepped series of obligations. And that's an argument that clearly has a lot of appeal. That is, people say, oh yes, surely, of course, we should all look after our children before we look after the children of strangers. It's an issue I discuss in the book, and I talk about that. I talk about some examples of that and how far should we go in saving our own children or helping our own children as against the children of strangers. I think that there's one sense in which we should stick to the idea that all human beings are of equal value, or at least that anyway, the fact that somebody is further from me than somebody else does not in itself lead to a moral difference in the weight I should give to helping that person or saving that person's life. Now, I say in one sense, I think that that's still true, and probably we can all think of ourselves in that perspective. We can all say, well, yes, there is a sense in which it's just as great a tragedy if a child dies in Mozambique as if a child dies in London. We shouldn't really think of them as different sorts of tragedies, as different kinds of losses. In all cases, there's the loss of a life, there's no doubt the grieving parents and family. That all matters equally. And yet there's another sense in which we feel people do have responsibilities to look after their own, to look after those who are close to them. And I think we can justify that in the sense that we will bring up children better if we have a system in which people have a primary obligation to their own children. That's something that draws on the natural bonds of love and affection that we have for our own children, and those are the best safeguard of bringing up children well, bringing up children in an environment that meets their psychological as well as their physical needs. There have been various experiments, utopian experiments throughout history to try and change that, to break away from this idea because of the fact that it leads inevitably to inegalitarian results. Some parents have more privileges and can pass those privileges on to their children. And of those experiments, perhaps the most benign have been the Israeli kibbutzim with their communal child-rearing efforts. But they too, in the end, admitted failure. They too admitted that they could not break the natural bond between parents and children, and they admitted that there were some, at least psychological differences, let's put it that way, between children who'd been brought up collectively in that way and children who'd been brought up with their parents. So I think we need to accept that as a system. And of course, if we accept that, we're going to try and encourage and foster loving relationships between parents and children. And we're not going to criticise those who give some preference to their own children. But that's a long way from saying that the level of preference that we have in this society here or in any affluent society is a justifiable one. Because that's, of course, a level of preference that we see as justifying us in heaping all kinds of luxuries and gifts and privileges on our children rather than doing, in some cases, anything at all to help the poorest children in the world. Or if we do something, it tends to be fairly trivial, tends to be less than the cost, let's say, of a single present that we might give our child on his or her birthday or at Christmas. And that seems to me to be wrong. That seems to me wrong for the reasons that I mentioned. We should not allow the barriers, the borders between nations, for instance, to be such major moral barriers that we devalue the life of the child in Mozambique, not just to half or even a tenth of our own child's life, but to some almost infinitely small percentage of it, so that we do so much for our own children and so little for others. So one of the values that I want us to engage in when we talk about world poverty is this question of, when we talk about the equal value of human life, are we at all serious? Do we really mean anything, or is it just rhetoric? Is it just lip service we're paying to an ideal? And if we mean something by it, then surely it's got to mean that we do something significant, even if it has some impact on ourselves and on our children, but not a really major impact, perhaps, for the benefit of those who are far from us. And I'm interested in changing the culture of what we regard as a requirement of living a minimally decent life, a minimally ethical life. And I set out in the book a scale that we might hold people to. It's also on a website I've got called thelifeyoucansave.com. And it's a scale that for most people requires you to give 1% of your income. Not a huge burden, but enough so that if most people gave 1% and those who are in the top 10% of taxpayers were to give more, and then I have a progressive scale beginning at 5% and going up to a third for the really super rich, if people were to give according to that scale, I calculate, we would be raising more than $1 trillion for helping people in extreme poverty. Compare that to the figure that Jeffrey Sachs, the UN advisor and Columbia University economist, says is necessary to meet the Millennium Goals, which include halving world poverty, halving the number of people in extreme poverty by 2015, or halving the proportion of people in the world, I should say, in extreme poverty by 2015. That's $189 billion. So in other words, if everybody in the affluent world, or nearly everybody, were to give according to this scale, we would have much more than we need to meet the Millennium Development Goals, 5 to 6 times as much as we need to meet the Millennium Development Goals. It's very substantial sums that can be raised relatively easily if we were all to put in. And that's really what I'm advocating, and I'm set up the website because I want people to actually do that in a kind of public way. You can go online and pledge to do that, and that's because there's good psychological research that says the more people see others giving, the more they're likely to give themselves. So what I want to do is to get a kind of virtuous reinforcing spiral of this becoming gradually more widespread until I hope it becomes a kind of social norm. So my work about animals, going back to animal liberation, which I published also in the 1970s, like that article I mentioned, is saying that the boundary of species is not in itself a morally crucial dividing line. That the fact that a being is not a member of my species is not a reason for giving less weight to the suffering of that being, to the pain or distress that it feels, or even just the boredom and frustration that it feels if it's confined in a barren factory farm, for instance, than we would give to similar levels of pain or suffering or frustration or boredom if they were experienced by human beings. And I see that as the key principle of how we ought to treat animals ethically. We ought to give equal consideration to their interests, and we ought to reject the boundaries of species as having in itself moral substance. Now, that's not to deny that some things which, by and large, are coextensive with the differences between species may be morally relevant in certain contexts. So it may be morally relevant in some contexts, for instance, that you're capable of listening to an abstract argument of the sort that I'm presenting to you, and as far as we're aware anyway, no non-human animals can do that. So we might say, well, people who are capable of that or potentially capable of that have a right to an education. Beings who are not don't. That's one obvious difference. There may be even other differences about the harm that is done when a being is killed, which relate to the extent to which a being lives for the future, because the being has a conscious awareness of the future. And that's something which typically human beings have and non-human animals do not have, or do not have to the same extent. I mean, I think it's clear that some non-human animals are capable of thinking about the future. You might have just been reading in the papers in the last week or two about a chimpanzee in a zoo in Sweden who was observed before the zoo opened to stockpile little stones and rocks that he found around the enclosure. And then when the zoo opened and visitors started appearing and poking their heads over the bars, he would use this stockpile to take aim. Well, obviously he was thinking about the future when he was building up the stockpile. But maybe he wasn't thinking about, oh, there'll be summer's coming, there'll be a lot more visitors, I better have a bigger stockpile. So, we think about the future maybe in more precise ways. But of course, not all humans are capable of thinking about the future in that way. And this is why this is not the same as saying it's simply the species that you're a member of that counts. It's actually having the capacities, or arguably perhaps you could debate it, having the potential for the capacities, but not simply whether you're a member of some species. It's true, of course, that if we continue with business as usual, adverse consequences of climate change will affect us, will affect people in this room, will even affect people of my relatively advanced age, as well as some of the much younger people. In fact, they already are. I'm Australian, as you know. Australia has been, I think, one of the first countries to be seriously adversely affected by climate change. The whole of southern and southeastern Australia is suffering a change in rainfall pattern. We used to call it a drought. I don't think that word is appropriate. Once something continues for 10 years, we are simply getting less rainfall than we used to get. The results of that just people in Melbourne, where I grew up and where I still spend some time each year, experience is that, their lawns go brown, they're not allowed to water them, we're not supposed to have showers more than 3 minutes. If we do have a shower, we stand in a big plastic bucket and we collect the grey water and we put that on any garden or plants that we might be trying to continue to grow. So there's a notable daily impact when you're in a city like Melbourne that is happening right now. But the impacts are going to be much worse in the future, undoubtedly. We are going to get changes in rainfall patterns, no doubt, in other places where they're going to have a more serious effect than the fact that your lawns go brown. Because, they have had a more serious effect in Australia, I should say. We used to be a major rice producer. That rice was grown with irrigation water. That really doesn't exist anymore. So we're ceasing to be a significant rice producer. That's tough for the rice growers, but they're not going to starve. They weren't living off their own rice. And we have a welfare state to protect them. But if the same thing happens to rice growers who are dependent on what they grow to eat and have no welfare state to fall back on, or other grain growers or other people engaged in agriculture, the results are clearly going to be disastrous. And we are going to get a situation with hundreds of millions of climate refugees because of that. And the worst consequences, the least predictable consequences, as I say, are the ones that are going to happen somewhere down the future. Nicola Stern on Start the Week today was talking about what is going to happen at the end of the century. And I imagine that a lot of people listening may have said to themselves, well, the end of the century's only just begun. I'm not going to be around at the end of the century. So if we are to be concerned about what is going to happen at the end of the century, then really any of you listening now, I suppose, probably are not likely to be around unless we have major progress in longevity at the end of the century. We have to have a concern for those who are not here yet. Now, some of you may say, well, that's going to be my children. My children are going to be around at the end of the century. I may say my grandchildren perhaps may be around at the end of the century, and we can have that kind of concern, which is an extension of concern for our kin. But I think we really ought to have a concern for those who will exist themselves. And this is what's sometimes hard for us to do. We often think of morality in a kind of a contractual way. There are models in ethics that have been put forward, social contract models of thinking about morality, some of which take the idea of the contract more literally than others. But at their extreme, they really say, well, morality is really about, I'll respect your rights if you respect my rights. So it's a reciprocity thing that we're talking about. Well, if we're talking about a reciprocity thing, we're not really going to have a lot of concern for the future, because there isn't much that the future can do for us. We're not going to be here when they're around, unless we're particularly concerned that they look after our gravestones or polish statues of us that we will leave to them. We really are going to have to do things for them in a more altruistic way. But I think that's what we should do. I think we should be regarding people who will exist in the future as just as important as ourselves, with perhaps a small discount for uncertainty, so that it's possible that an asteroid will collide with a planet in the next 50 years and there won't be no sentient beings at all on the planet at the end of the century. Well, that's a very small risk. Maybe we should discount the interests of those at the end of the century by whatever that probability is, whether it's 0.25% or less, of some catastrophe of that sort, wiping out the species, wiping out life on the planet. But putting that aside, we should be giving equal weight to the future. And that's, I think, one of the great things that Nicholas Stern did in his review. He refused to accept the standard economic view that we should discount the future. Discount it not just because of the loss of investment returns if we spend money on one thing rather than investing it, but discount it because it is the future, which has been a fairly standard assumption in economics, that we apply a discount rate to the future. Some people argue for it because they say it's the revealed preferences of people. People actually do care less about the future and save less, would rather have consumption now, will pay more for consumption now than they will pay for consumption in the future. And so we should in some way reflect that. If in fact people do behave in that way, I think they're making a mistake. They're behaving irrationally. And if we're thinking ethically, if we're thinking about our values, we should say in this case too, as in the other cases I've mentioned, the lives of people in the future and the lives of animals in the future is just as important as the lives of those living now, subject only to this small discount for uncertainty. So we should give full weight to the interests of those in the future. And if we really do that, then that means that the case for doing something really major to prevent climate change now is an overwhelmingly strong one, because I think all the evidence shows that it's going to get, the longer we leave it, the harder it is going to get to fix this problem, and the greater the unknowns, the greater the risks that we will end up with some really catastrophic situation. Not just the kind of situation that maybe we can cope with, even if it does cause hundreds of millions of people to become climate refugees, but something that really could make the planet uninhabitable or virtually uninhabitable.